Hello and welcome back to another episode. In this video I'm finally going to review the Commodore Amiga 500, so let's go! The Commodore Amiga 500 is a 16-bit home computer. It was developed by Amiga Incorporated, which belonged to Commodore since August 1984. It was produced by Commodore and released in North America and in Europe in 1987 for a retail price of $699. The Amiga 500 has a Motorola 68000 CPU running at 7.16 MHz in NTSC machines and 7.09 MHz in PAL machines. It also has 512 KB of RAM, 4 8-bit stereo sound channels, and in terms of graphics, the Amiga 500 is capable of resolutions from 320 by 200 to 640 by 200 on NTSC models and 320 by 256 to 640 by 256 on PAL models. Depending on the resolution, the Amiga can either display 16 or 32 colors simultaneously out of a color palette of 4096 colors. But with some tricks and special modes like for instance interlaced, overscan, extra half bright mode or hold and modify mode, the Amiga 500 can display even higher resolutions and or more colors simultaneously. The keyboard and the 3.5-inch floppy disk drive, which uses 880 KB double density floppy disks, are integrated into the Amiga 500 casing. The design of the Amiga 500 came from the Commodore 128 and the Commodore 64C model, but to be fair, I think it also had something to do with the fact that Commodore's biggest rival Atari used a very similar design for the Atari ST computers, and the Amiga 500 was the direct competitor to those machines, at least in 1987. An essential part of the Amiga operating system, called Kickstart, is stored on a ROM chip inside the Amiga 500. Earlier Amiga 500 models came with Kickstart version 1.2 and the rest came with Kickstart version 1.3. Even though it's not really the same, you can actually compare the Kickstart to a BIOS in a PC computer. Every time the computer starts up or gets resetted, the Kickstart performs diagnostics and system checks. It activates all the components of the system plus every other device that might be connected to the computer, like a hard drive for instance or an extra floppy disk drive. And it tries to boot from every capable source, starting with the one of the highest boot priority first, of course. Thanks to the fact that Amiga computers have the ability of auto-boot and auto-detect, there is only a very small percentage of devices and even a smaller percentage of programs and games that need a software installation. Also, you don't have to type in any commands in order to load a game, for instance. Just insert the disk and the Amiga will do the rest. Therefore, you can say the Amiga 500 is for the most part as user-friendly as a video game console. The Amiga 500 is a successor of the very first Amiga computer, the Amiga 1000. It was released in 1985 for $1,300 and technically it was almost identical to the later released Amiga 500. The biggest differences are that the Amiga 1000 is a desktop computer with an external keyboard and not an all-in-one system like the Amiga 500. Then it only came with 256 kilobytes of RAM, and the Amiga 1000 doesn't have a Kickstart ROM chip. Instead, you had to load the Kickstart from a floppy disk every time you turned on the computer. Except for the early developing phase, the Amiga 1000 was always intended to be an office or business computer and not a pure gaming computer. And even after the Amiga Corporation was bought by Commodore, they were able to convince Commodore and continue with this strategy. So right from the start, the Amiga 1000 was only sold in specialized computer stores and advertised as a work computer. Now for 1985, the Amiga 1000 was an impressive computer with outstanding graphical and sound-wise capabilities, plus a multitasking operating system that could easily compete with IBM and Macintosh, especially in terms of best value for money. The only problem was, it wasn't taken seriously. It was the new and unknown system released by Commodore, which was best known for creating the Commodore 64 gaming computer. And because of those circumstances, the Amiga 1000 wasn't really on any company's wish list when it came to buying new office computers. And on the other hand, it was also not that desirable as a home or hobby computer, because 1 year earlier, in 1984, Atari released a very similar computer like the Amiga 1000, the Atari 520 ST, for only $799, and this one was marketed as a gaming or home computer. So bottom line, the Amiga 1000 didn't sell very well. It wasn't a total failure, but the selling numbers were much lower than Amiga and Commodore expected. As a solution, they decided to change their tactic with the next Amiga computer, or actually computers, and create a computer for each of both markets and clearly define them. The result came in 1987 with the release of the Amiga 500 as a home/gaming computer for $699 and the Amiga 2000 as a work/office computer for $1,500. The Amiga 2000 was technically identical to the Amiga 500 in terms of CPU and chipset, but it already came with 1 MB of RAM, a battery-packed real-time clock, and since it was a big desktop computer with an external keyboard, it had many expansion capabilities. There is a slot for an extra 3.5-inch floppy disk drive, then another one for either a 5.25-inch floppy disk drive or a hard disk, or a CD-ROM drive, which was later available. Then there is a slot for a CPU upgrade, another one for a video card, then 502 slots for all kinds of expansions or RAM upgrades, and 4 ISA slots, which, if I'm not mistaken, can be used to make the Amiga 2000 also PC compatible. Now, even though the Amiga 2000 was a very impressive computer with all its upgrade capabilities, most companies still preferred the products from IBM and Macintosh over the Amiga 2000. But it actually had some success, since it was a very popular choice for schools, TV stations and movie studios as a video editing computer. With the Amiga 500 it was a different story. With its release, video game developers became aware of the Amiga computer as a gaming system and noticed its graphical and sound-wise capabilities. And slowly but surely more and more video game developers, for instance like Electronic Arts, the Bitmap Brothers, Psygnosis and so on, started to make their games primarily for the Amiga 500. Of course, most of the games were also released or ported to other computers and video game systems as well, but from that time on the Amiga had the highest priority for those developers. But not only video game developers showed a lot of interest in the Amiga 500, also video gamers, or actually customers, became more and more interested in buying an Amiga 500. And by 1990, the Amiga 500 was the best-selling home computer in Europe. This success continued up to the year 1992, and afterwards it slowly went downhill for Commodore, and 2 years later in 1994 they went bankrupt, and the Amiga computer was history. On the front of the Amiga 500 we have the already mentioned keyboard. On the top right are two LEDs, the computer power LED and the floppy disk drive access LED. Depending on if it's an earlier or later Amiga 500 model, those LEDs are either red and green or green and yellow. And no, it has nothing to do with different kickstart versions. On the right side is the floppy disk drive, and on the back, starting from the left side, there are two 9-pin controller ports. Now this might sound unusual, but normally joystick 1 is reserved for the mouse and joystick 2 for the control of player 1. And if you play a 2-player game, then the second player connects his or her controller to the joystick port 1. In a few cases it's the other way around, but for the most part this is the standard. Then we have the left and right stereo audio output, a port for an external floppy disk drive, a serial port which is used for data transfer like a modem for instance, then a parallel port where you can connect a scanner or printer for instance, then we have the connector for the power supply and an RGB video out and composite video out. Sadly, the composite video out is only in monochrome, but as far as I know, every Amiga 500 came bundled with the A520 TV modulator, which you connect to the RGB video out, and this little device adds an RF and color composite video out to the Amiga 500. If you don't want to use the TV modulator, you can also connect a monitor to the RGB video out or use an RGB SCART cable, which is a very popular choice, at least in Europe. On the left side of the Amiga 500, underneath a plastic cover, we have an expansion port. This expansion port was used for many helpful devices, like accelerator cards, RAM upgrades, hard disks, or an external CD-ROM drive for instance. As an example, I have here the SuperDrive 500 XP. It's a combination of a hard disk and RAM upgrade. It has a 40 MB hard disk and 2 MB of fast RAM, which could be upgraded to 8 MB. Beside the expansion port, the Amiga 500 has also another expansion port on the bottom side, called the trapdoor expansion slot. This expansion port was used for 512 KB slow RAM upgrades. Many different companies made those back in the days, that's why you can find them in all kinds of sizes and different designs. Almost every owner of an Amiga 500 bought one of these, since at the end of the 80s more and more games required 1 MB of RAM in order to play them, and by the 90s it had become a standard to have at least 1 MB of RAM. Normally those upgrades also came with a battery backup for the real-time clock, and some also already had or were later modified with a switch to turn on or off the slow RAM expansion. The reason for this switch was that some games, mostly earlier titles, would not work with the slow RAM expansion. Therefore a switch was more convenient than removing the expansion every time you didn't need it. Anyways, a big warning and heads up about those battery backups. Get rid of them as soon as possible if you haven't already. Today there is at least a 90% chance that they don't work anymore and the acid inside those batteries has already leaked out. And this acid is some really nasty stuff, which eats circuit boards for breakfast. And the same thing goes also for every Amiga 500 Plus owner. The only difference is that in those machines the battery is actually on the motherboard, which can be an even bigger problem, since if those batteries leak they can destroy the entire computer. So again, if you have an Amiga 500 with a 512 slow RAM upgrade or an Amiga 500 Plus and the battery is still in there, remove it and clean the area thoroughly. One thing that you might have already noticed is that there is no on and off switch on the Amiga 500. That's because the on and off switch is actually on the power supply. The Amiga 500 also doesn't have a reset button, but if you want to reset the computer you can either do a hard reset and turn it off and on again, or you can do a soft reset by pressing the keys Ctrl and both Amiga keys on the keyboard at the same time. Next, let's take a quick look inside the Amiga 500. This right here is a revision 5 board made somewhere around 1989 and 1990. On the bottom we have the 512 KB chip RAM. Then we have the Kickstart ROM and the Motorola 68000 CPU. And then we have the custom chips. Fat Agnes addresses the chip RAM and controls the DMR channels. Denise is the graphic coprocessor, Paula is responsible for the sound, and here on the right we have Gary, which provides glue logic for bus control and houses supporting functions for the floppy disk drive. This custom chip setup that we have here in the Amiga 500 is called Original Chipset, or OCS. You can find it also in the Amiga 1000 models and the Amiga 2000 models. Beside the original chipset, there are also the Enhanced Chipset, short ECS, and the Advanced Graphic Architecture, short AGA. ECS was used in the Amiga 500 Plus, Amiga 600, Amiga 3000 and the Commodore CDTV. It was an improved version of the original chipset that was able to handle more chip RAM and display some higher resolutions in special graphic modes. But back in the days, the ECS machines weren't very popular because the improvements were only minor, and a big drawback was that many games, old and new ones, wouldn't work with this chipset since they were not programmed to work with such a chipset. The AGA chipset was used in the Amiga 1200, the Amiga 4000 and the CD32 video game console. Also, the AGA is based on the original chipset, but it is much more improved. Not only does it have the same improvements like the enhanced chipset, but it also was able to display now 256 colors simultaneously out of a color palette of 16.7 million colors. And in special graphic modes there were even much more colors simultaneously possible and resolutions up to 1440 by 576. From this time on, some video games were only made for AGA Amigas. Others were now released in two versions, a normal version for all Amiga computers and a special AGA version, and also some older titles were now re-released with more colors and higher resolutions for AGA computers as well. Also, Amiga computers with AGA chipset have problems with some older games, but those compatibility issues are not as bad as with the enhanced chipset. So still more games will work on an AGA Amiga than on an ECS Amiga. Today there is a solution for this problem called WHD load, but that's a completely different story. Since we are already inside the Amiga 500, I'm gonna use this opportunity to explain the difference between chip, slow and fast RAM and how they work. So I'm gonna add the slow RAM expansion and the SupraDrive 500XP, which has the fast RAM for a better visualization. Now, chip RAM is the most important RAM of them all, since not only the CPU is using it, but also the custom chips Paula and Denise. Agnes is in control of the chip RAM and makes sure that everybody gets their turn, so one by one the CPU, Paula and Denise can use the chip RAM. This is normal and it works. If we add now the slow or Ranger RAM to the computer, the only thing that happens is that the CPU gets more resources /RAM, which is good since it allows you to play more games and run more programs which have a higher RAM requirement. But none of the custom chips have access to the slow RAM, and since the CPU still has to wait until Agnes decides that it's the CPU's turn to use it, there is no improvement in performance whatsoever. And that's why it's called slow RAM. With fast RAM it's a different story. The custom chips still don't have access to it, but the CPU uses it directly, and as long as the CPU has fast RAM available, it doesn't have to use the chip RAM. Only when the fast RAM is full, the CPU has to go back in line to use the chip RAM, but as long as there is fast RAM available, the CPU and the custom chips work separately but at the same time, which results in a better / faster performance of the computer, and that's why it's called fast RAM. One word of advice though about fast RAM. If you add fast RAM to an Amiga 500 or actually any other Amiga computer, it doesn't necessarily mean that you always get a better performance. It depends on a couple of different factors. Does a game or a program actually take advantage of fast RAM? how much fast RAM is available, 1 megabyte, 2 megabyte or maybe even 8 megabyte. And most importantly, does a game or a program support fast RAM? Now I'm not that familiar with programs since I've never used that many back in my Amiga days, but when it comes to games I know that there are some which can handle any type and amount of RAM that you can fit in an Amiga 500, then others can only handle cheap and slow RAM, and others, mostly early Amiga titles, can handle only 512 kilobytes chip RAM. If you have anything more, then those games will not work, so please keep that in mind. Next, let's talk about games, since the Amiga 500 is best known to be a gaming computer. Like PC-DOS games or Atari ST games, also Amiga games were mostly released in cardboard boxes of all kinds of sizes and shapes. Like we already know, the games are stored on 3.5-inch 880 kilobyte double density floppy disks. Beside the game disc or discs, there were also of course a manual inside the box and almost every time a reference card and postcard, which you could use if you wanted to order another game from the same company. Other things that you could find depending on the game of course were catalogs, code wheels or code books if the games were password protected, stickers, maps, other books, basically all kinds of stuff could be inside those game boxes. Most Amiga games consisted out of 1 to 4 floppy disks, but there were some games which even had more. One example of a lot more that I have in my collection is Indiana Jones and the Fate of Atlantis, a very cool Lucasfilm point-and-click adventure game that consists out of none less than 11 floppy disks. But again, games with more than 4 floppy disks were the exception. Still, a game with only 2 or 3 disks could require a lot of disk swapping while playing it, and if disk swapping was something that bothered you and you had some extra cash, you could upgrade your Amiga with either an external hard disk or an external floppy disk drive. Now I've already mentioned that there were hard disks available for the Amiga 500, but not that many people bought them since they were very expensive. Depending on when, where and what kind of hard disk you wanted to buy, they could cost you as much as a brand new Amiga 500 or even much more. Also, as far as I know, not that many games actually supported a hard disk anyway. A popular alternative was an external floppy disk drive. They usually cost around $70 to $100, which was a little bit more than the cost of a 512 kilobyte slow RAM expansion, and they made the life of an Amiga gamer much easier. Just connect it to the back port of the Amiga 500, turn it on, and there you go. On the back of the external floppy disk drive is also a port to connect another disk drive to it. In total, the Amiga 500, and if I remember correctly any other Amiga computer, was able to handle a maximum of 4 floppy disk drives at the same time, so the internal one plus 3 external ones. I never had one back in the days, and even though I really could have used one for some specific games that required a lot of disk swapping, I can't say that I had less fun with the games or with the Amiga 500 without one. At the time I was used to it, and you can't really miss something that you never had. So an external floppy disk drive is a cool and helpful accessory, but it's not a necessity, at least not in my opinion. And now the time has come to show you some games for the Amiga 500. There are thousands of Amiga games out there, and up to this day I might have played about 300 of them, more or less. It's not my goal to play all of them, but there are still tons of great games which I haven't played so far and or which I don't have in my collection yet. And deciding which titles I wanted to show you in this review was not an easy task. But I was able to narrow it down to 20 games, and no, those are not my top 20 Amiga games of all time, those are 20 Amiga games which I consider a classic, which I've enjoyed back in the days, which I still like today, and which I already have in my collection. Let's start with Rainbow Islands, the story of Bubble Bobble 2. A platformer by Taito where you have to save the Rainbow Islands from the evil Prince of Darkness and his minions. The game was first released in the arcades and later on converted to many computer systems and video game consoles. The Amiga version was made by a company called Gold, and it's one of the best conversions, and it is very close to the arcade version. The graphics are very colorful and everything including the enemies looks super cute. Also the music is nice and fits it perfectly, which increases the cuteness factor even more. Beside the fact that I never got very far in the game, I still like it a lot. If you like pinballs and video games, then you probably heard of Pinball Dreams made by Digital Illusions. In this game you can play 4 different pinball tables, each one with a different theme, and it's all about the high score of course. The game was first released for the Commodore Amiga, and since it was such a success it was later ported to many other systems as well. The pinball tables are interesting, the ball physics were great for the time and still are today, the graphics are beautiful and the music and sound effects are also really good. Digital Illusions didn't stop after Pinball Dreams, no sir, they made a sequel called Pinball Fantasies. In Pinball Fantasies you get another 4 different themed pinball tables, and again, since it's pinball, it's all about the high score. The only difference in this game is that you have now 4 large pinball tables, because in Pinball Dreams there were 2 small and 2 large pinball tables. For the rest, Digital Illusions used the same recipe like in Pinball Dreams, so everything that I already said about Pinball Dreams also counts for Pinball Fantasies. Both are awesome pinball games for the Commodore Amiga. Walker is a side-scrolling shooter from DMA Design, where you take control of a mech armed with machine guns and travel through time in order to win a war in the far future. For the time it was one of the more gorier games, since they don't hold back with pixel blood. Even though the graphics are for the most part dark and somewhat depressing, they are actually pretty nice, especially the animations of the walker. Sadly there's no in-game music, but the theme song is good and the sound effects are excellent. New York Warriors is another shooter. It was made by a company called Synergistic Software, and it's actually a conversion of an arcade game called Delta Command. In this game you are a one-man army and you fight your way through several districts of New York City in order to stop the street gangs of New York from detonating a nuclear warhead. It's obvious that the game designers were influenced by the movies The Warriors and Escape from New York when they created this game, which might have been one of the main reasons why I immediately fell in love with this game the first time I saw a screenshot back in the days in a video game magazine, since I'm also a very big fan of those movies as well. Sadly, if there's a lot going on the screen, then the game suffers from slowdowns, but except for that it's a pretty cool game with good colorful graphics, great sound effects and a kick-ass soundtrack. Metal Masters is a futuristic fighting game from Incal Products. In a faraway future where most cities lie in ruins after many big wars, gigantic battle robots are built to fight against each other in a championship for the title of the Metal Master. By winning fights you earn money to repair your robot and buy new and more powerful body parts in order to compete with stronger opponents until you win the title or run out of money. Graphically it's pretty nice, except for a title song which is good, there is no in-game music and the sound effects are okay. Now, Metal Masters might not be a well-known Amiga title, it's also not one of the best games for this system, but I really like it and that's the reason why it's in this review. FA-18 Interceptor is a flight simulator from Intellisoft. In the game you can choose to do just a free flight, fly training missions, or fly the actual/story missions with either an F-18 Hornet or an F-16 Falcon. The game was one of the early Amiga titles released in 1988, and for 1988 the game was a remarkable flight simulator with very good 3D graphics, controls, and the game runs on a very playable speed, even on a stock Amiga 500, which wasn't very common. The reason I mentioned this is because 3D games were a big thing on the Commodore Amiga, but most of the times the games would run very slow on an Amiga 500 without an accelerator card, since they were meant to be played on more advanced Amiga computers. Anyways, what's also cool in this game is besides the normal runway, you can also take off and land on an aircraft carrier. And since the game takes place in San Francisco, you can also visit the Golden Gate Bridge if you want to. FA-18 Interceptor is a game that almost every Amiga 500 owner has played at least once, since on one hand it is a really good flight simulator which was very popular back then, and on the other hand the game came at some point bundled with Amiga 500 computers. Even though I never cared much for the story missions, I had a lot of fun with this game, just doing some free flights and training to land the planes, mostly on the aircraft carrier. Just to be prepared, you never know, in case a pilot gets sick in real life and the crew asks if there is a passenger on board that can land this plane, then I can raise my hand and say yes, I've spent many hours playing FA-18 Interceptor and I know how to land this plane. If you ask an Amiga owner about a good racing game, then his or her answer will probably be a game from the Lotus trilogy from Magnetic Fields. Either Lotus Esprit Turbo Challenge, Lotus Turbo Challenge 2, or Lotus 3 The Ultimate Challenge. All three games are very enjoyable racing games with very good graphics, good sound effects and amazing music. Even though all three games look and play very similar, there are still many differences between those games, and I'm just gonna mention a few of them since I wanna keep it short. In the first game you always have a split screen since it was designed to be a two-player game. If you play the game alone, then you see this nice animation of the two mechanics working on the car of the second player. In the game you participate in a championship and you also have a fuel gauge which you have to keep an eye on, especially in later races since you have to refuel at the box in order to finish the race. Otherwise you run out of fuel and lose the game. Before each race you can choose one of 4 different songs, which one you want to listen to during the race, or if you only want to listen to the sound effects. If you choose a song, then you will also hear the sound effects, but from time to time it can happen that they interfere with each other. It's not too annoying, but it is noticeable. And lastly, you always drive with a Lotus Esprit Turbo SE.
Box. Set. Go.
In the second game you race against the clock and the fuel gauge is gone. The game is in full screen if you play it alone and split screen in the 2-player mode. Some races you drive with a Lotus Esprit Turbo SE and others with a Lotus Elan SE. Sadly, the option was removed to choose the music before the races since there is no music anymore during the races. But the theme song and the music between races is still great. In the third game, Magnetic Fields took basically all the best ideas from the first two games and combined them into one game and added also some new stuff as well. Which means that in this game, in single player mode you have full screen and in the two player mode you have split screen. You can decide if you want to race against the clock or participate in a championship. Before each race you can choose one out of 6 songs that you want to listen to during the race or just the sound effects. If you choose a song, then you don't hear any sound effects at all, but the music is now in full quality and without any distortions. Then before the first race you choose one out of 3 cars which one you want to race with. Either the Lotus Esprit Turbo SE, Lotus Elan SE or the Lotus M200 concept car. The game has also a track editor allowing you to create all kinds of different tracks, plus you can choose if you want to play the game with the original tracks, the self-made tracks or a combination of both. I personally like all 3 games a lot, but in my opinion Lotus 3 The Ultimate Challenge is the best one out of those 3 games. If you're into turn-based strategy games, then Battle Isle from Blue Byte might be the right choice for you. Yes, the Battle Isle series started on the Commodore Amiga, and yes, the idea for this game originally came from the PC Engine game Nectaris, also known as Military Madness on the TurboGrafx 16. The game takes place on a planet called Chromos, and you, the player, are Walter Harris and you have been kidnapped from Earth by the Drulls in order to lead their troops against the armies of the evil Skynet Titan computer brain. To win the war on Chromos you have to accomplish 32 missions, either by taking over the enemy's headquarters or by destroying all enemy units. Depending on the map/mission, you are in charge of many different air, sea and land units, buildings like the headquarters or factories and depots that you have to hold or capture, and also resources have to be found and captured since you need those and the buildings to build and repair units. It's a cool and sometimes tough game with good graphics, good music and also good sound effects. Apidia is a side-scrolling shooter from Kaiko. Ikuro, the hero of the game, has transformed himself into a magical bee with the help of an ancient family heirloom in order to fight the evil creatures which are guarding the way to the castle of the dark wizard Hexei, who has poisoned Ikuru's wife Yuri. The only thing that can save her is an antidote which is somewhere hidden inside the castle. So you try to get to the castle, defeat Hexei, find the antidote and save your wife. The game has really nice graphics with interesting and sometimes disgusting enemy creatures. By destroying specific enemies you get power-ups to upgrade your bee with faster movement speed, shields, drones or stronger weapon systems. Depending on your settings at the start of the game you can activate the upgrades yourself or let the computer make this decision for you. The game has also good sound effects, but definitely the highlight of the game is the amazing soundtrack which was made by Chris Hülsbeck. Cannon Fodder is a strategic shooter from a top-down perspective made by Sensible Software. Typical for such a military game, you have to complete missions for your superior/government. Each mission contains out of 1 to 5 phases/levels, and at the beginning of each mission you get 50 new recruits for those military operations. For the most part you start a level with a team of 4 soldiers, which you can either control as a whole group or you can split them up in separate teams, but you can only control one team at a time. If you manage to keep your men alive and complete a mission, you will rise in rank and they get some slight improvements, like the aim gets better or their weapons have a longer range. If you lose a soldier, then he gets replaced by another recruit. If you run out of recruits or cannon fodder, then the game is over. Even though it's a war game, it doesn't take itself seriously. I mean, even the theme song is called War Never Been So Much Fun. The graphics are very nice, but they look more cute and cartoonish than realistic. The sound effects are great, and the same thing goes also for the music as well. Battlehawks 1942 is a flight simulator made by Lucasfilm Games. The setting is the Pacific during World War II. You can either fly training missions or historical campaigns. You can decide if you want to fly for the Americans or the Japanese Empire, and before you start you can also choose one of 3 planes on each side, the difficulty setting of the enemies, and on which altitude you want to begin the mission, since in this game you don't take off or land the plane. You always start in the air, and you normally also finish the mission in the air, except if you crash or use the parachute. Back then this was a very realistic flight simulator, and all the campaigns are based on real historical battles and missions. The game doesn't have any music, but the graphics and sound effects are really good. Battlehawks 1942 is definitely a game that would benefit if you have an accelerator card or if you play the game on a more powerful Amiga computer, but it is still playable and enjoyable on a normal Amiga 500. Wings of Fury is a side-scrolling shooter made by Unlimited Software. It is also set in the Pacific during World War II, but in the year 1944. In this game you fly an F-6F Hellcat fighter aircraft for the Americans, and in each mission you have to eliminate all the enemy troops in order to progress to the next one, which is not an easy task since you have to fight against ground troops, bunkers with anti-aircraft guns, many different kinds of ships and enemy fighter aircrafts as well. Your weapon arsenal consists out of your board machine guns and either bombs, rockets or a torpedo, which you have to choose depending on which type of target you are going to attack next. Takeoff and landing on your aircraft carrier is the first and most important lesson in the game, since you have to do this a lot during a mission, either to change or reload your weapons, refuel or repair your plane, or to continue to the next mission after you finish the current mission. There is no story in the game, and the missions are not based on any historical events or missions. For its time, Wings of Fury was considered a violent game, but don't forget it's a game about war, which is nothing but violent, and it's just a video game, nothing more. Wings of Fury has some really good graphics, good music and excellent sound effects. Speedball 2 is a futuristic sports game made by the Bitmap brothers. It is basically handball on steroids with pinball elements, which I'm sure was influenced by the movie Rollerball with James Caan. The game is simple, just throw the ball into the opponent's goal. During a match, bonus items and power-ups appear on the game field, and on the side of the game field there are also some devices which can give you some advantages or bonus as well if you hit them with the ball. And those are the pinball elements that I was mentioning before. By winning matches you earn money to train the abilities of your team, and of course the goal is to win the championship. Another great game with cool graphics, good music and sound effects, and a great atmosphere and presentation. Fancy a game of poker? Then how about Hollywood Poker Pro from Reline Software? Yes, it's a strip poker game, so what? It's a classic, many people played it, even though some might refuse admitting it, and I'm not ashamed to say that I have learned how to play poker with this game. You only gamble with virtual money, not your own real money. You play against 4 beautiful ladies. The game has nice graphics with a zoom function, how naughty, and a very good soundtrack, made again by Chris Hülsbeck. Moonstone: A Hard Day's Night is a turn-based action-adventure with role-playing elements made by Mindscape. In this game you take control of one of 4 knights and you search the layers of the land for the 4 keys that allow you to enter the Valley of the Gods to challenge the Guardian of the Moonstone. And if you're able to beat him, taking the Moonstone at the right moon phase to Stonehenge to participate in an ancient ritual and prove yourself worthy to take a place among the gods. The layers are protected by all kinds of evil creatures, and beside the dragon there are also the Dark Knights, which are trying to stop you on your quest. By clearing layers and defeating enemies, you gain experience points which you can use to improve your abilities, and beside the keys you will also find gold, magic items, scrolls and potions in the layers to help you on your quest. You can play the game alone or with up to 4 players, and even though it's a very gory game with a lot of pixel blood, this game also doesn't take itself too seriously. It's more a dark humor, and it's like playing a game of the movie Monty Python and the Holy Grail. But if you want, you can turn off the gore factor at the beginning of the game. Moonstone: A Hard Day's Night has some very nice graphics, good music and good sound effects. Street Rod is a racing game made by California Dreams. The game takes place in the US at the beginning of the 1960s, and you have decided to use this year's summer break and your hard-earned allowances to buy a used car and participate in the 90 street races to become the king of the road and win the girl of your dreams, Betty Sue, the girlfriend of the current king of the road. You have about 2 months to accomplish this task, and in this time you have to win a lot of races to earn money, of course, and also respect, since only if you have become a well-known driver you're allowed to challenge the king and not sooner. The real cool thing about this game, beside the cars and the atmosphere, is that you have to do all the tuning yourself. It's not like in other racing games where you just buy a stronger engine and it's already fitted and ready to drive. No, you have to buy the right parts, disassemble the old engine and build in the new engine yourself. And it's not only the engine, also carburetors, manifolds, transmissions, tires and so on. The game is a lot of fun, especially for every car freak. It has beautiful graphics, nice music and good sound effects. And the last game that I wanted to show you is Elvira: Mistress of the Dark, a point-and-click horror adventure game with role-playing elements made by Horrorsoft. Elvira has just inherited an old castle which once belonged to her great-great-grandmother, Lady Imelda, an evil witch who loved to torture and kill her servants and lovers for fun. And now Elvira is a prisoner in her own castle, since Imelda's minions have risen from their graves, taking over the castle and preparing everything to resurrect Lady Imelda so that she can continue her old hobbies. And you have been hired by Elvira to save her and to help her stopping Imelda's minions. To do that you have to solve many riddles, fight many creatures, and you also have to mix a couple of magic potions. This game is definitely not for the faint-hearted. It's a scary, violent and gory game, especially because of all the graphical death animations, but if you like horror games, then this is the game for you. The game will challenge your mind and your reflexes with its puzzles and evil creatures. It has breathtaking graphics, great sound effects and a scary but beautiful soundtrack. Elvira: Mistress of the Dark is definitely one of the best games on the Commodore Amiga. So now that you have seen some of the games that I have for the Commodore Amiga, there's still a couple of things left that I want to talk about before we come to an end of this review. One thing that I haven't mentioned yet is that the Commodore Amiga 500 is also region free, but there can be some problems or differences if you play a PAL game on an NTSC system and vice versa. One thing that can happen is that because of the slightly different resolutions, it can happen that games will be displayed slightly bigger or smaller than intended, and also there can be some speed differences. So for instance, if you play an NTSC game on a PAL system, it can happen that this game runs slightly slower. Back in the days and also today, there are some solutions for these region problems, if there are actually any. yeah, there are some programs that allow you to switch the region. Then also some hardware accessory have this option or this extra feature to allow you to switch the regions. And I think it is also possible on a Commodore Amiga 500 to modify it with a region switch, but I'm actually not sure about that. Now, if some of you are interested in buying an Amiga 500 for the computer with all the or for the system with all the cables and power supply and mouse, you can expect prices to pay on sites like eBay, for instance, between, yeah, let's say 60 to 300 US dollars. Of course, it all depends on the condition. So for instance, for 300 US dollars, which is actually a little bit expensive, but for 300 US dollars, you would get everything boxed and everything in a super mint condition. For 60 bucks, yes, the system should be complete, not in the best condition, but at least it should work. But those are the normal numbers for just the system / the computer with all the cables and with the power supply. Now for boxed games, you can expect to pay prices between 10 to up to 200, 240 US dollars. Also depending, of course, on the condition. If it's complete with everything that came back in the days, the game that complete, I mean the game with the box, with the manual, and sometimes with some extra features or extra stuff like stickers and everything, or maps or code wheels, whatever. And it also depends, of course, which title you wanna buy. There are, of course, also some rarer titles and some, yeah, pretty casual titles. And also, if those games are still sealed or if they are super rare, then of course the prices can be a lot higher than 200, 240 US dollars. Now when it comes to accessories, yeah, I will not say any prices because there are way too many accessories to list and too many companies who made accessories. One thing that I haven't mentioned or showed you anything, normally I also show controllers and everything, but in the end, yeah, I mean, the Amiga mouse has two buttons. You have the left button, you have the right button. Same thing almost like on a PC, and also on the Amiga normally the left button has has a specific how do you say this, a specific function, and the right button also has a specific function. And when it comes to joysticks and controllers, well, the best known joystick from that era is this one, the Competition Pro. Why it is, why it's a special one, or why it is so noticeable and so famous? Basically because of the technology that is inside, because of the micro switches. If you here now, this is arcade technology basically, and also the buttons, they have micro switches in them. And yeah, but besides the Competition Pro, there were a lot of other joysticks or controls that you can use. There were also some flight sticks. There are many joysticks out there which have a lot of fire buttons, but in the end the Amiga computer and also for instance the Commodore 64 and also the Atari ST, they all had one fire button joysticks in the end. So it doesn't matter if you push the left button or the right button, all have the same function. So even if you have a joystick, which I actually have in my collection, which has 6 or 8 buttons, but each one of those buttons has the same function. So in the end, this is one of the reasons why I didn't show it when we took a closer look at the system, which I normally do in other reviews. But anyways, I just wanted to mention it. But yeah. Sorry, one other thing that I wanted to mention, since we're already talking about accessories, is that even there are tons of accessories from back in the days with external disk drives and hard disks and everything. There are also some modern accessories available for the Commodore Amiga or the Amiga 500. For instance, you can get a PS/2 adapter, which allows you to use a more modern mouse instead of the old Amiga mice actually. Then there are, for instance, USB drives. I guess only the company Gotek made those, but in the end what you can do with those USB drives is you can replace the internal floppy disk drive. The reason why you would do this is because of the fact that today many of the floppy disks are already dead or in the beginning of dying, since floppy disks have a lifespan or life expectancy actually between 10 to 30 years. And since the Amiga 500 is now over 30 years, most of the disks already have reached their life expectancy or lifespan, or are about to die. In the end, what happens is that they lose their magnetization. And when this happens, then the laser, actually, is it the laser? Inside the floppy disk drives, or the laser, no, it must be a laser head. I'm sorry, I don't have it right now in my head what it actually is, but I think it's a laser head inside the floppy disk drive. Can't read the data anymore, which are normally stored on a floppy disk. And it's an alternative if you wanna go that route, to buy a modern USB drive, replace the USB drive, or replace the floppy disk drive inside with this USB drive, and in the end you can put the ROMs of the games on a USB stick and put it inside and still use the original hardware. This is actually the idea, to use such a USB drive. It's not for everyone. I actually thought about it, but I never really wanted to do it myself, mostly because you would have to modify the casing of the Amiga 500, which I didn't want to do. But this is also one modern accessory which you can use or can buy. And one other accessory, for instance, which you can also find, a more modern accessory, is one of a couple of different accelerator cards are available for the Amiga 500, like the Vampire 500, then there is the Witcher 500i, and my personal favorite, the ACA 500 Plus from Individual Computers, an awesome and amazing accelerator card with a lot of extra features. But I've already made a huge review about this card before, so I'm not gonna say more words about the ACA 500 Plus, even though it's also another alternative of the USB drive actually, because you can how do you say this, instead of using floppy disks or the USB drives, you can use this accelerator card and some compact flash cards and go another route, to play the games, for instance. And you can also use WHD load with this thing, but in the end I already made a review, and I promised myself at least that I'm not gonna talk about this amazing accelerator card anymore. So anyways, what is still left to say? Yeah, one thing, my final verdict, of course, and would I recommend the Amiga 500 to any gamers or collectors? My final verdict is this: the Amiga 500 is my all-time favorite old-school video game computer of all time. When I grew up, I had this computer, not this one actually, I sold it back in the days to buy a PC, but anyways, today I have about 3 Amiga 500s. I have so many great memories playing the system alone, playing it with my brother, and playing it with friends. So for me, it's just an amazing system. And to be honest, I can't be very objective when it comes to the Commodore Amiga 500, because it's it's such an important system to me. But in the end, I think it's an amazing system for the time when it came out, 1987. It had, the graphical and sound-wise capacities of the system were amazing, and I personally can highly recommend the Commodore Amiga 500 to any gamer and also to any collector out there. And speaking of collectors, what I also have not mentioned yet is that there was a limited edition which was only released in Germany, and this edition was called the Stefanie Tücking edition. Stefanie Tücking was a popular radio and TV hostess back in the 80s in Germany, and if I'm not mistaken, she became later on also an actress. Of this limited edition, Stefanie Tücking limited edition, there are two different designs were released. One is called the ball design and the other one is called the leopard design. Both of those designs were manufactured in a quantity of 10,000 units. So in total, this edition had 20,000 units. 10,000 ones were the leopard design, and the other 10,000 were the ball design. Except for the fact that the top cover of the Amiga 500 is printed on the outside with one of those designs, and that the original box came with an extra cardboard sleeve around it with a picture on it, so that you would know which one of those two designs you would buy, or which of the Amiga 500s you would get if you would buy one of those. They are completely identical to just a regular Amiga 500. So they don't have any more RAM, they don't have any CPU upgrades or anything. I actually don't know why Commodore made this edition. I also don't see the relationship between Stefanie Tücking and Commodore or an Amiga or a gaming computer. I guess it was just some kind of a marketing strategy. In the end, they are out there. They are more rare than just a regular Amiga 500. So you can expect to pay a little bit more for one of those, especially if they are complete and in good condition with this extra cardboard sleeve. I personally never tried to get one of those designs myself. I think the ball design looks okay, but the leopard design, it looks totally weird today, and it looked totally weird also in the 80s. But anyways, they are out there, and if you are interested, then yeah, go ahead and try to get one of those. Okay, and now we are at the end of my review of the Commodore Amiga 500. I really hope you enjoyed the show. Maybe see you next time. Take care. Bye.